of what is this particle that has been shown in some papers to come out of some people who are ill. And I believe that that particle, based upon my research, is not a virus as we understand it, meaning some kind of living or non-living, depending on your opinion, piece of material that comes from outside and invades us and causes an illness. What I have found is that there is a part of our body called an exosome. And I learned about this from virologists, so those are scientists who study viruses, that they have seen the homology or similarities between exosomes and viruses. And there are many papers out there stating that a virus and an exosome are the same things. One of the most prominent researchers in HIV, who was at Johns Hopkins, actually made a statement about this, Dr. John Hildreth. So I started investigating what exosomes are, and I could not believe the amount of similarities of things that were identical between what has been claimed about the COVID-19 virus and what has been shown in various experimental studies about exosomes. And further, when I first looked at electron microscope photographs of the virus and then looked at electron microscope photographs of exosomes, they were virtually indistinguishable from each other in appearance.
Okay, so are you saying there are exosomes and there are viruses and never the twain shall meet, or are people looking at exosomes calling them viruses?
Well, it's even more complicated than that, but certainly one possibility, a strong possibility, is that people are looking at exosomes and causing them viruses. But I think it's important to go back in history a little bit because the word virus comes from the ancient Latin. And what it means is a noxious substance or poison. And so before the era of microbiology, before microscopes were even invented and people had no idea that there were such a thing as microorganisms, they used the term virus and they used it in the context of studying illness. They thought it was some kind of substance that was in the air at that time that would you would breathe in and would cause disease. But they really didn't have experimental studies to show that it was more of an idea or a theory. Later on, when the microscope was invented and we started realizing that there were bacteria and fungi and other small organisms like amoeba that we could see, that led to thinking that could it be that those microorganisms cause disease? And this is known as the germ theory. Louis Pasteur is most famous for putting that theory forward, but actually the idea predated him by a number of decades. And as science progressed and technology progressed, the electron microscope was invented because the particles that have been subsequently identified as viruses are too small to see under a conventional optical microscope with lenses. So the electron microscope allowed them to visualize these tiny little particles, and that led to the theory based upon germ theory that these particles, which they then termed viruses, are responsible for causing several diseases. And basically, at the time, the diseases that they applied this to were diseases that they did not know the cause, that they believed to be infectious. Now, go ahead.
So then let me ask you this. Are you saying that you believe, in your opinion, that COVID-19 is an exosome-related situation?
Yes, that is my opinion.
Okay, so then now they're using as justification to lock us up in America and really the world at large that, hey, we gotta self-quarantine, we gotta social distance, we gotta wash our hands 30 or 40 times a day. Is an exosome, what you're calling an exosome, something that can be transmitted from one person to another?
Well, it's not fully known if that's the case. It has not been studied, but I don't think that that is the most important thing about exosomes. What the important thing is that exosomes have been shown to be not a cause of illness, but rather a response to illness. And their role in the response to illness is to facilitate healing. So, for example, there's studies that, well, one particular study that I looked at closely that has demonstrated that exosomes are able to gobble up toxic substances. So what they did was they mixed some cells, human cells or mammalian cells, with bacteria, and these were bacteria that were secreting toxic. They call them endotoxins, and if our cells are exposed to those endotoxins, it actually bores little holes in the cell membrane, and then the contents of the cell leaks out and the cell dies. So what they did is they mixed the bacteria with those toxins with cells that were not expressing exosomes, and all of the cells died. And then they had another group of cells that were expressing exosomes, and those cells survived. And they were able to capture some images of under the electron microscope of those toxins actually inside the exosomes. So essentially what they were doing is containing them so that they could not cause the damage to the cell. So this is one real excellent example where the exosomes help us heal from an insult or an injury or a disease rather than being the cause. So the particle size of the exosome is virtually identical to the claimed size of the COVID virus, which is about 500 nanometers, and a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. So they're very, very tiny. Incidentally, much smaller than the pore size of these masks, including the N95 masks, which would provide no barrier at all. They would go right through it.
Which the World Health Organization originally said was the case, right? But now you have, we're making 50 million masks or whatever, which it's not going to work, right?
Absolutely, and you can even find scientific papers that show this. So this is not just by my reasoning, it's actually, there's papers that highlight this. But so if these exosomes were able to spread from one person to the other, I would postulate that they would actually serve as a warning to the person who received them that there could be some kind of toxic exposure, and it would help prepare their body to deal with that.
So now they're not. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that there's not scientific evidence behind that. This is just my opinion about it. I want to be clear because I think it's crucial to the audience that when I make a claim, I'm making it based upon a solid scientific study with good evidence. And when there's areas where there's gaps of this evidence, and so all you can do is make an opinion or generate a hypothesis. But I want to mention that specifically so that your audience knows what can be backed up with scientific evidence and what is just a reasonable conclusion by putting things together where no evidence exists.
Okay, so if exosomes, as you say, are not the cause of the sickness, but rather the effect of a sickness that's already present, is that the right understanding?
That's correct.
Then why are all these people getting sick at the same time? How can that even be possible?
Sure. Well, I think you should consider an example like this. Let's say that you attend a dinner with a large group of people at a restaurant, and you have a very nice evening. However, let's say there's 25 people in the group. So somewhere around the middle of the night that evening, let's say 12 people out of the group wake up and have vomiting and diarrhea, right? So they've all gotten sick at the same time together. Many of them may be couples and they're living in the same house, and maybe both people are ill, or maybe only one is ill and the other one is not ill. Now, the reason that they woke up in the middle of the night with vomiting and diarrhea is not because they passed some infectious agent between each other. It's because they all ate a certain dish at the restaurant that was contaminated with food poisoning. So this is an example of how you could be misled by your observations and assume that it's a contagious process that passes an illness between people, when in actuality it is that they had a common exposure to some kind of toxic insult that caused the problem.